So thank you, everybody, for joining us today for Acadia Center's presentation on the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, our findings and recommendations for the third program review. So happy to get to talk with everybody. Next slide. So I'll give you a little background on who Acadia Center is. We are a nonprofit focused on advancing bold, effective, and equitable clean energy solutions for a livable climate and a stronger, more equitable economy. We do our work focusing on 6 areas: climate and clean energy, including clean energy and climate pathways, where we work on RGGI, and we are funded by foundation grants and individual donations. Next slide. As I said, we're funded by individual grants and foundation donations, and we have been rated a 4-star charity by Charity Navigator for the last few years. Next slide. We do our work through a combination of research and advocacy, and then stick around to implement. And RGGI is definitely an example of how we have done that. We were helpful at the beginning of helping the states form RGGI and have been active participants throughout, keeping an eye and making sure that RGGI is working for everyone. Next slide. So we're here to talk about our report that came out last week on April 4th, findings and recommendations for the third program review. Really excited to get to share some of the results that we found, key report findings, some of the recommendations that we have for policy shifts that the states could make in this third program review. And then we'll talk a little about what's next, how all of you can get involved, and how we can work together to make RGGI into an even better program for the 12 states involved. I will turn it over to Ben.
Great, thank you, Amy. So the RGGI program was launched in 2008, so it's been in operation for over 14 years at this point. It currently includes 11 states that are actively participating in allowance auctions. And RGGI is a cap and invest program. This means it applies a regional limit to the amount of CO2 that can be emitted from fossil fuel power plant generating units over 25 megawatts in capacity. Owners of these plants must purchase CO2 allowances from states via auction. This provides a source of revenues to states, which they can use to invest in various programs that we'll touch on later in the presentation. All in all, RGGI has generated over $6.2 billion in proceeds since 2008. Next slide. For those not familiar, RGGI recently kicked off their third program review. The image on the left provides the current timeline for this program review. The program review is well behind schedule. It was supposed to kick off in the fall of 2021, but we're glad to see now that it's moving forward. Program review offers an opportunity to update the model rule. The model rule is a common framework that individual state regulations are built off. Importantly, program review and updating of the model rule provides an excellent opportunity for implementing RGGI policy changes, such as the ones outlined in our report and later on in this presentation. Next slide. One thing to note on this slide, throughout the report and this presentation, you'll see multiple references to the 9 consistent RGGI states. This refers to the 9 states pictured in dark blue on the right that have consistently participated in RGGI since its inception. Focusing on these 9 states enables consistent analysis of regional trends over time. There are multiple references to the rest of the country as well. This means the 40 states in the US that aren't the 9 consistent RGGI states, or California, which has its own emissions trading program. With that preamble, this slide highlights some of the top takeaways from our report. I'm not going to read through them line by line because we get into them in greater detail later on in the presentation. Next slide. At a regional level, RGGI has demonstrated the ability to simultaneously achieve both GHG emissions reductions and economic growth. The top left portion of this graph highlights that the 9 consistent RGGI states, in blue, have achieved a 50% increase in GDP per capita since RGGI was launched in 2008. This is 13% more growth than the rest of the country in yellow over the same time period. The bottom right portion of the graph highlights that the RGGI states, again in blue, have also reduced power sector CO2 emissions 50% over this same time period. This is a 10% greater reduction than the rest of the country. So in summary, RGGI states have seen a 50% increase in GDP per capita and a 50% decrease in power sector CO2 emissions since RGGI was launched in 2008, outpacing the rest of the country on both metrics. Next slide. Concerns that climate policy will make states less competitive are directly refuted by RGGI's experience. Overall, RGGI states are faring much better than the rest of the country on electricity price trends. RGGI states, shown in blue, saw average retail electricity prices decline 3.2% from 2008 to 2020. The rest of the country saw a 7.7% increase over the same 12-year time period, as the graph showed. Even integrating recently released 2021 price data, which is not shown on the graph, the gap is even wider. RGGI states saw a 3.6% decrease in average rates from 2008 to 2021, while the rest of the country experienced a 9.5% increase in average rates over the same time period. Next slide. RGGI has been a piece of the puzzle in shifting RGGI states away from coal generation. Coal generation declined 91% from 2008 to 2021 in the 9 consistent RGGI states. In the rest of the country, coal still accounted for 24% of total generation in 2021, but only 2% of all generation in the 9 consistent RGGI states. Simultaneously, since 2008, the amount of electricity generated by wind and solar combined increased over 800% in the 9 consistent RGGI states. However, while RGGI has played a role in shifting states away from coal, it has room for significant improvement in driving the deployment of renewables to displace natural gas generation. Gas generation has increased over 30% since 2008 and now accounts for nearly half of all generation in the 9 consistent RGGI states. Next slide. As many of you know, Pennsylvania is technically a RGGI participating state, but has yet to participate in an auction. Simultaneously, Governor Youngkin is attempting to withdraw Virginia from RGGI. This graph depicts how the amount of emissions covered by the program has increased over time as new states have been added, with New Jersey in yellow rejoining in 2020, and Virginia in green joining RGGI in 2021. The far right column shows what RGGI would have looked like in 2022 if Pennsylvania in blue had participated in auctions. In 2022, Pennsylvania and Virginia combined would have accounted for about 57% of total RGGI emissions, highlighting the importance of their participation. Looking at 2021 and 2022, the average estimated proceeds from just Virginia and Pennsylvania combined would have been about $1.2 billion per year. To put that in context, that's enough revenue to install about 110,000 whole home air source heat pump systems per year. Next slide, please. So now we're going to pivot over to RGGI market dynamics. There's a lot going on in this graph, so let's walk through it. As highlighted in the dark blue line, RGGI market prices have been on the rise in recent years. Beginning in late 2019, the clearing price increased in 11 straight auctions, and the average clearing price in 2022 was nearly 4 times higher than in 2017, just 5 years earlier. There are 3 important market mechanisms to highlight on this graph. The dashed red line represents the Cost Containment Reserve, or CCR, which is intended to keep allowance prices from rising too high. The dashed green line is the Emissions Containment Reserve, which withholds allowances from circulation to secure additional emissions reduction if prices fall below an established trigger price. Finally, the dashed gray line is the reserve price, or price floor, which ensures that allowances are not sold below a certain price. Next slide. So taking a closer look at these 3 market mechanisms, there are a few important things to highlight. For the Cost Containment Reserve, as auction prices have risen sharply in recent years, this mechanism has become more of a factor. However, the current CCR trigger price of $14.88 is relatively low. For example, it's 13 times below the recently proposed EPA social cost of carbon, and it's significantly below the average 2022 market prices in the European and California, Quebec carbon market. With regards to the emissions containment reserve, as auction prices have risen in recent years, it has become less of a factor, with all four auction clearing prices in 2022 being at least double the ECR trigger price. Finally, the price floor simply hasn't kept pace with rising auction prices. The price floor hasn't been reached since 2012, and while the average clearing price has increased six-fold since 2010, the price floor has only increased 30% over the same time period. Next slide. Over time, RGGI participating states have adopted increasingly aggressive renewable energy portfolio standards, clean energy standards, and economy-wide GHG reduction targets. Historically, the RGGI emissions cap has been set independent of specific clean energy goals or economy-wide decarbonization goals mandated by the state. Acadia Center asked the question, what would the RGGI emissions cap from 2025 to 2050 look like if it were set at a level commensurate with the clean energy and GHG reduction laws in RGGI participating states? The graph on this slide answers that question. There are two ways of looking at this, focusing only on the 9 consistent RGGI states, which are highlighted by the blue line, or focusing on all 12 RGGI states, including Virginia, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, which are represented by the orange line on the graph. The 9 states would need to decrease electricity sector emissions 95% below 2021 levels to keep pace with state laws. The 12 states would need to decrease electricity sector emissions 89% below 2021 levels to keep pace with state laws. Any way you slice it, the RGGI states will need to aggressively ratchet down the cap to match the aggressiveness of state clean energy and climate laws. Next slide. So at this point, I want to turn to some of the highlights from the environmental justice community's analysis we covered in the report. But first, a few words on language use. For the purposes of this report, we utilize the term environmental justice community to refer to environmental justice, frontline, and environmentally overburdened communities that have experienced disproportionate harm caused by the impacts of the fossil fuel economy. As demonstrated in the previous slide, at a regional scale, RGGI has had success in driving down GHG emissions and supporting economic growth. However, RGGI's impact on EJ communities has been less closely examined. So we came to this effort with 2 overarching research questions. Number 1, have RGGI proceeds been invested in EJ communities? And number 2, have levels of key pollutants declined in EJ communities? Next slide. To answer question number 1, let's look at how RGGI Inc. tracked proceeds or spending. The chart on this slide shows proceeds spending for the most recent year that data is available, that being 2020. On the left, we have proceeds spending by category. So for example, energy efficiency or clean and renewable energy. On the right, we have proceeds spending by recipient type. So for example, residential or low income. In 2022, about $1.2 billion in proceeds were generated. States invest this money in a variety of ways, as demonstrated by the graph. Energy efficiency, direct bill assistance, clean and renewable energy, GHG abatement, beneficial electrification, and finally, unfortunately, RGGI funds are sometimes rated for general fund purposes. Next slide. States could significantly improve quality of life in EJ communities by making targeted investments of revenue generated in RGGI auctions to improve the quality of housing, lower energy burdens, improve air quality, and reduce associated health risks. However, as you can see from the previous slide, the categorization of how RGGI proceeds are spent is very broad. States collect frustratingly little data on how RGGI proceeds are invested in EJ communities. So, for example, as the previous slide showed, 35% of 2020 proceeds went towards energy efficiency. But what portion of these funds were invested in EJ communities? It's not possible to accurately answer that question with the currently available data. While a number of RGGI states allocate some level of proceeds to various efforts with benefits that could flow to EJ communities, at the moment, New York is the only state with a law requiring that a set percentage of proceeds be allocated to disadvantaged communities. The law calls for 40% and no less than 35% of investment to be realized in these disadvantaged communities. To put that in context, in 2022, 40% of all New York RGGI proceeds would have been about $115 million. However, New York Climate Justice Working Group is still ironing out the definition of disadvantaged community. And it's not completely clear at this time how these investments will be tracked and verified. And with that, I'll now turn it over to Paula, who will walk through some of the EJ air pollution analysis we performed for this report.
Thank you, Ben. Hi, everyone. Moving forward to our analysis, let's talk a little bit about methodology. So to investigate pollution impacts of specific power plants on specific communities, we first had to define which census tracts were of interest. So we relied on both conversations with environmental justice groups and some academic research to inform our decision to use EPA's EJ Screen tool and the White House Environmental Council, Council on Environmental Quality, CGIS tool. And for both of these, we used it as our key data sources. We looked at the census tracts that were above the 90th national percentile that any of these indicators categories fell on. Next slide, please. And continue with that methodology. This is this illustration showing what we did. We mapped the power plants that are under the RGGI regulation, that are regulated under RGGI, and created a 3-mile radius. And we focused on if a census tract fell within that 3-mile radius, it would count towards the calculations of that power plant. So if there was a census tract that was above the 90th percentile in any one of our 8 indicators, we would classify it as it fell within an CQ or an EPA EJSI census tract. One thing to note is that the 3-mile radius touches multiple census tracts. And it is also important to remember that while the population within the 3 miles are not the only ones affected by the pollution, that research says that the population within 3 miles are typically burdened with the greatest impacts. Next slide, please. Then finally, in our methodology, we focused on NOx and wanted to take a little bit of time to explain why NOx. We have 3 reasons why. One is that electricity generating units at fossil fuel power plants are among the largest emitters of NOx, and NOx has been linked to respiratory illnesses and acid rain. Secondly is because NOx also leads to the formation of other pollutants like fine particulate matter and ground level ozone, which are also very harmful and have serious consequences on the respiratory system. These pollutants can exacerbate asthma, lung cancer, other respiratory diseases. And finally, it's a data issue also. NOx had the most readily available data, and so we could get the most accurate results. Next slide, please. So let's look at the maps. We included 5 maps in the report. I believe this is the first map. And let me walk you through what's going on. So once we've found what power plants under the RGGI rule are within 3 miles of an EPA EJSI census tract, we map them, and they are labeled by these circles and triangles. The triangles identify the ones that are within an EPA EJSI community. And this was overlaid with what we called a plant NOx exposure level. which is a term we used for saying NOx and population. So if it's in a densely populated area, the power plant produces a lot of NOx, it'll be in that dark red eye. And if it is in a less populated area and probably a little less NOx, it'll be low in it. It's in the low category, which is a more white color. So the interesting facts about this one is that we found that 83% of RGGI power plants are within 3 miles of an EPA EJSI census tract. And if you look at urban areas in New York City, 20 out of 20 plants are within 3 miles of an EJSI community. In Connecticut, there is a stretch along the I-95 and I-91 corridor. 9 out of the 9 power plants also fall within them. We can see Maine, all 6 power plants, and Boston and Philly, they have 4 power plants in the urban area, and they all also fall in proximity to an EPA EJSI community. We also wanted to highlight that although 83% of them are within 3 miles, there's also only 41% of the census tracts in the region that are classified as an EPA EJSI community. So it would be likely that a random distribution would not create this sort of these sort of percentages. Next slide, please. And since we do have that classification already of which power plants are within an EPA EJSI community, we wanted to see the trend over time. And we can see a significant decline in emissions overall. Nonetheless, this fact doesn't show that the emissions in EPA EJSI communities are going down faster. Overall, we do want to see the yellow line on this graph be a lot steeper than the blue line. Next slide, please. Let's look at map number 2. This map is solely focused on the White House CEQ tool, and in that we only looked at the asthma ones. Because this is one indicator, you will see the census tract regions is smaller, it's only 11%. Here we also identified them as within or without using the circle and the triangle. The triangle being that it is within 3 miles of a CEQ asthma census tract. And in this one, you will also see the heat map on top of or below the power plants. High meaning higher population, higher NOx, low meaning lower NOx and lower population. If we walk through the New York City plants, 19 out of 20, you can see they are close to an asthma burden census tract. In Boston, 4 out of 4 plants. In Maine, you see 4 out of the 6 plants. And fun fact is if you do New York, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts, 61% of the power plants are in proximity to high asthma communities. Next slide, please. All right, so to talk about the next couple of maps, it was important to also look at the methodology of this. We developed this NOx pollution threat score as an initial approach for identifying the relative public health threat that power plant emissions create as a way to inform targeting of regulations and aid states in identifying them. So let's look at an example. Animation, please. Let's look at our top polluter right now. Using this methodology, we took East River Generating Station. They produce 3,000 tons per year. The census tracts within the 3-mile radius sum to that much of the population, and the average of all the census tracts and all 8 indicators put it in the 48th percentile, and then multiply all of that, and you get the NOx pollution threat score. Can I get the next animation too, please? And with that threat score, since this was the highest one, this is ranked as a 100 scale, and the rest of the power plants fall on the scale of the East River Generating Station, which is 100, and it goes down from that one. Next slide, please. So with that in mind, let's look at our third map. We ended up mapping the top 5 polluter plants per state, and discover states like Vermont that only has 2 power plants. We only mapped the 2 power plants, but this helped us identify who could be a problem. And if we look at this, our map also has our circles and triangles, identifying which plants are within both a EPA EJSI community and a CEQ asthma census tract, and they are sized according to their NOx pollution threat score. So the bigger they are, the higher the pollution threat score is, the smaller they are, the lower the pollution threat score is. And we also classified them as primary fuel type. And to note, primary fuel type doesn't mean that it's the only fuel type at the power plant. It's likely that there is a multi-fuel power plant, but it is to say that it is the primary pollution source or production source. Here, if we go to the next slide, please. Here we can see a top 10 NOx pollution threat score. It's basically a grading system we have, and to look closely at what's going on and who's a big issue with this pollution threat score. If we had the animation, one interesting thing we saw is that 6 out of the 10, the top 5, were in the New York metro area, and this is due to the larger population of the New York metro area. So if I get the second animation too, please. It was really interesting to see that the coal power plants, which produce 9 times more NOx emissions, fell lower on the scale than the gas power plants, because the gas power plants have 26 times the population living within that radius than the coal power plants do, which means that this pollution is affecting much more people. And if you see also the last column, we have the EPA EJSI or asthma indicators listing what are those census tracts that are above the 90th percentile that are close to those power plants. And as you can tell, the New York power plants are close to much more, or more of these indicators than those coal power plants are. Next slide, please. Okay, let's look at our fourth map. This is a separate topic, but to give a little bit of context is that currently, under the RGGI rule, the generating units that are above the 25 megawatt hours are subjected to the emission cap. And recently in New York, it's the only state that included an expansion to this, including smaller generating units, which were from 15 to 25 megawatt hour capacity. And so a number of organizations are advancing recommendations that the threshold for all the states should be lowered to 15 megawatt hours. And so we took a closer look and evaluated the magnitude or the importance of establishing this RGGI-wide rule to lower the threshold. And so we found that in total, there's 240 smaller generating units that would fall under this threshold for all the states. And the alarming part was 91% of these smaller generating units were in proximity to either one of our 8 indicators, a census tract within one of our 8 indicators. And if you exclude New York, Virginia, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania collectively account for 71% of the NOx emissions that are coming from these smaller power plants. And to conclude this, if we included the smaller units, we would have generated about 26 million annual proceeds in the past year. Next slide, please. And our last map. This map also came from a data need from our conversations with health professionals. There is a great need for better air quality monitoring, and we wanted to evaluate how our plants are doing with respect to air quality monitoring. So looking at EPA's air quality monitoring site data, we also did that 3-mile radius and located the plants that don't have an air quality monitor within 3 miles of them. And we found that 68% of the RGGI power plants don't have active air quality monitors within a 3-mile radius. And of those 68, 79% of them are located in proximity to an EJSI or a high asthma census tract. And our 4 states, New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and New Jersey, collectively account for 73% of the plants of the region that lack both the monitoring and are within 3 miles of a EJ community, as we've defined it. So really highlighting the need of increasing air quality monitoring in the area. And if you look at the map, they're also classified from low, medium to high in the pollution threat score. And we looked also at the primary fuel type of those power plants. And so if we go to the next slide, we have our list of our top 10, so we can compare them to the top 10 overall. And one thing we did notice was that these are in more rural areas. So if you look at the pollution, at the population, comparing both of our top 10 scores, this population tends to be smaller than the one that we just saw. And if we put the animation on, we see more coal plants in these areas. So 5 out of 10 of our plants are coal plants, which are at higher NOx pollution, which means that air quality monitoring is actually pretty important in those areas. And next slide, please. And with that, I will pass it on to Amy so she can wrap it off and talk about policy recommendations. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bella. So what do we do with all this great data that the Acadia team has generated? We came up with some recommendations for things that the states and RGGI can do in this 3rd program review to ensure that a lot of these shortcomings and quirks that we've identified can be addressed. So the first one is to align the cap and market mechanisms with state policy. As Ben explained, all of the states have mandates and plans for renewables to come onto the system and for greenhouse gas emissions to be reduced. And RGGI, in order to stay relevant and be a tool that is really being used to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, needs to take account of those aggressive state climate and clean energy goals and set the cap no higher than those levels would suggest. We also need to adjust the market mechanisms, the CCR price, the ECR price, and the reserve price, the price reserve, the floor, to better align with the state decarbonization policies, as well as the social cost of carbon. The social cost of carbon, as Ben pointed out, is orders of magnitude larger than the RGGI prices have been lately. As well, we need to increase the reserve price rate of escalation to align with how market prices themselves are escalating, so we don't end up with a situation like we have now, where the price floor is set at, kind of historically and irrelevant price levels. So, next slide, please. Our second recommendation comes from the fact that one of the themes that you may have heard from this presentation is, well, there wasn't great data on that. And that is to ensure that EJ communities directly benefit from the investments that are being made from the RGGI proceeds, but also that we have better data and accounting and holding states responsible to commitments that they make. We need to clearly articulate how the environmental justice communities are being defined and transparently track whether the programs that are identified as providing EJ community investments are actually meeting those metrics. And we need to adjust programs to make sure that those benefits are really being delivered and the minimum percentage investment is being achieved. We also need to centralize this information in a frequently updated publicly facing report or dashboard. It's really able to be understood by a wide variety of stakeholders and that allows standardization across the RGGI region so that we can, much easier than we did in this report, be able to say, that all of the states have committed to investing 40 or 50% of proceeds in environmental justice communities, and they're all doing a good job of meeting those metrics. Next slide, please. And here's that recommendation. We need to ensure that EJ communities directly benefit with better investment. So establishing a requirement that a minimum of 40 to 50% of RGGI proceeds are invested in the EJ communities. This value needs to stay stable, even if the state makes a ill-advised, in my opinion, but it happens, decision to raid RGGI funds for other uses. And we need to establish a requirement that members of the EJ communities get to have meaningful participation in the decisions regarding these programs. Next slide, please. Finally, we uncovered that although RGGI itself is not an air quality program, it has had substantial results in air quality on a regional level. And the power of the regional cooperation can and should be used to improve the health and air quality of more localized areas. We need to accelerate the decreases in NOx emissions at the power plants that pose the largest respiratory health risks. Acadia Center would suggest that we start with that NOx top 10 threat list, where there's a combination of both large NOx emissions, key communities that are being harmed, and large population size. And we need to increase funding and enforcement of air quality monitoring, especially in EJ communities. Next slide, please. Finally, we suggest, in echoing the recommendations of a number of our environmental justice partners, lowering the threshold capacity for RGGI regulation. Because these small plants, although they would only deliver 26 million in proceeds, which at RGGI scales is not all that much, 91% of these smaller generating units are within 3 miles of one of our EPA, EJSI, or high asthma communities. So the health impacts of regulating these smaller plants can really be significant for people. By including all generating units of 15 megawatts or higher, and even lower for co-located units, like down to 10 megawatts or so, RGGI could have a significant health benefit in these localized areas. Next slide. So what's coming up next? The RGGI third program review is going on now, and there is a written comment deadline of April 21. Acadia Center is working to put together group comments on that. And if you're interested in signing on to our comments, please reach out to Paula, whose information will be on the next slide. We're also beginning to explore our research of the maps in detail. We put together these maps that have all kinds of overlays, and I think there's a lot of lessons still to be gained from really digging into those. We're continuing to lead RGGI coalition calls across the region. Again, if you're interested in participating, feel free to reach out. And generally, feel free to reach out to us if you would like to get more involved in these efforts or discuss RGGI related issues. We love talking about RGGI. We love thinking about ways that environmental advocates, environmental justice advocates, and all of us can get better involved in making sure that this really crucial program for the region can deliver the best of its benefits. Next slide. So for more information, here's my contact info. And we will also share Paula's with everyone. She is leading our RGGI work here. I should have said at the beginning that if folks have questions, please drop them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I've seen a few questions come in that I have addressed. One of them being, we will post this presentation on our website as well as a video of the presentation in coming weeks. But you have all three of us experts who helped write the report to ask questions of now. So please feel free to put questions into that box. Okay. I'll start with one. Let's see, come up with one on the spot. Should have done that in the past. Oh, here's a question from Dan Collins. What's the likelihood that additional participating states would increase auction prices? Similarly, what about lowering the capacity cap? Do you have thoughts on that, Ben?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it partially depends on what states are added and kind of what their emissions profile is currently. And then in tandem, how aggressively the emissions cap is set for those states. So, I mean, you know, Pennsylvania, for example, has a lot of coal generation. So if Pennsylvania was added to the program, combined with a fairly aggressive cap being set, you know, it could have the potential to increase auction prices by the exact amount, you know, haven't tried to project out those numbers, but it's going to vary a lot. You know, if a state with a more kind of a cleaner energy profile was added, it might have a kind of a different effect than adding a coal heavy state like Pennsylvania, for example.
One aspect that I thought was interesting that came out in preparing this report was comparing the auction prices that we have been seeing, which are, you know, much higher than when RGGI began, with the social cost of carbon, or with the prices that we're seeing in, you know, European carbon auctions, or even in California. Do you have thoughts about that, Ben? About, you know, just because allowance prices are increasing, do you think that that's necessarily a bad thing?
No, I mean, I think it's good overall. You know, if you know, clearing prices are increasing, right, it's setting a market signal that RGGI's getting serious about driving emissions reductions in RGGI participating states. And yeah, you mentioned, you know, the social cost of carbon, which I believe was, you know, yeah, $168 per ton recommended by the EPA, about 14 times the clearing prices we saw in RGGI in 2022, so significantly higher. And then, you know, the report also highlights that the prices in both the California, Quebec, and the European Union markets, especially in 2022, were significantly higher than the clearing prices that RGGI's seen. You know, not an exact apples to apples comparison. Those two carbon markets encompass other parts of the economy beyond just power generation, but the California, Quebec market clearing prices in 2022 were kind of in like the mid $20, around $25 range. And in the European Union, they were right around $80 per ton. So yeah, significantly higher than the clearing prices we've seen in RGGI. So I think sort of demonstrates that, you know, those economies are able to kind of bear the higher CO2 allowance prices without significantly impairing, you know, economic growth either in California, Quebec, or European Union. So I think the RGGI program does have significant kind of room to increase carbon prices.
Thanks. So here's a question, I guess for kind of both you and Paola. What would the RGGI program look like if the emission level to defined units that must comply was lowered? So that's like moving the 25 megawatt threshold down to 15. How do you think that would change the program to make that change?
Paola, do you have the, I can look at the report for the specific numbers on that. It wasn't a huge amount in terms of overall CO2 and NOx emissions coming from the smaller generating units, specifically the ones between 15 megawatts and 25 megawatts. But as Amy pointed out, and you know, through our analysis, we found that, you know, a very large percentage of those smaller generating units are located in proximity to EJSI or high asthma communities. So, and they do make up also a higher percentage of overall NOx emissions than CO2 emissions, right? So these plants are kind of producing more NOx per megawatt hour of generation compared to their CO2 levels than your kind of like typical RGGI plant. So, right, they're producing a lot of NOx for their relatively small size, and they're located in proximity to these EJSI or high asthma communities. So they kind of have this outsized impact. So I think it's important primarily to encompass those plants, you know, from a health impact standpoint. Even though the, you know, overall kind of like CO2 impact of bringing those plants into the program may not be a huge difference maker. That's kind of my high level take.
Have either of you heard about discussion of maybe including mobile sources within RGGI? I don't think I have heard anything about that. And, you know, one way to do that, I guess, would sort of be like the TCI program, you know, which is using some of RGGI's regional cooperation to create a way of attaching a price of carbon to fuels that that fire up the mobile sources of things like cars and other transportation. Here's another question. Based on past experience, how receptive do we think the states will be to our recommendations? Do either of you have thoughts on that? If not, I can take it.
I would just say it is data-based, so it typically had a pretty good response, and yeah, I think it's a pretty good starting point to conversation, I guess.
Yeah, I think so too. I think the states and RGGI have been pretty receptive in prior program reviews. You know, the initial cap certainly has changed greatly with that first program review. And even in the second program review, adding a few different compliance mechanisms and changes to the market to make it work more efficiently. Is there a set of metrics or state measurement of RGGI program expenditures to capture the EJ community that you would like to see other states follow? Happy for either of you to jump in, or I can take this one. In making that recommendation that states provide better data on how the money is being spent, you know, I think if they're determining that part of the way that they're meeting, you know, that 40 or 50% commitment is through, for instance, electrification projects and weatherization projects within a particular set of communities. Like if that's how they're saying we're meeting our EJ commitment, which is, then we need to know if that program is working. So the metrics of the program itself, how many houses were served, how much energy was saved, what did people's bills look like afterwards? What kind of benefits is this program delivering? And those sort of metrics that would, intrinsically be part of that program need to be followed and figured out whether the investments are actually having the achieved effect that the state has decided that they will. Hey, those are the open questions. If folks have any more questions, we are happy to take them. I have a question for you, Paula, which is if people wanted to get involved with the third program review and with some of the work that Acadia Center is doing to submit comments and to raise awareness, what's the best way for them to do that?
The first step is contacting me. Comments are due on the 21st, so we're definitely trying to get them all together in the next week. I believe that's, the next week in a couple of days. So please be in touch. The next thing is we're always open to hearing data needs or data concerns, and what else can we expand on. It's important to hear everyone's voice, and reach out.
Definitely. Yeah. We tried putting our contact information into the chat box. I noticed that goes to hosts and panelists, so I'm not sure if y'all are actually getting the chat, but we will send a follow-up email, certainly, with a link to the presentation, the video, and our contact information. Here's an additional question. Is there a specific number you're recommending the cap decline by? Sam, I don't know if it's possible to go back to the slide where we have the cap declining, but essentially the specific number is based on the targets that the states have set. So the cap should decline by whatever the emissions number is. I don't remember what number slide that would be. It's in Paula's section, I believe.
It's slide 15 then.
15. Okay. Thank you, Sam. Here we go. Whoop. Back up.
Yep.
There we go.
There you go.
Yes. So it depends partly on what states are participating in RGGI. So the yellow line here is if it's all 12 states. So that's including Virginia and Pennsylvania. Virginia and Pennsylvania have a little less aggressive climate targets, as well as more emissions to start with. So the cap would look different than if it was just the 9 consistent states, which is this blue line here. But as you'll notice, in the earlier years, 2030, or even back to 2025, the line is higher because a lot of those emissions targets really start to kick in around 2040, 2045, and 2050.
Yeah, and I would just say, I mean, the two numbers we mentioned on this slide are, if you look at just the 9 states, it's not, the high level number is 95% below 2021 emissions levels by 2050. If you look at all 12 states, it's 89% below 2021 by 2050. And obviously we can give like further guidance on that in comments to Reggie, et cetera. What if it was 11 states or 10 states, and give out the year by year kind of breakdown. And so there's different ways to slice it, but that's kind of the overall trajectory that we'd like to see at a minimum as far as the RGGI emissions cap. And as you can see, the current emissions cap sort of just flat lines. That's the green line after 2030. So obviously we need to be significantly more aggressive than the current emissions cap represents. And I'd also say that the table 1 in the report, it's not included in this presentation, but it's a table breaking down all the clean energy and climate policies at the state level for all 12 of the states. So as Amy said, you can see some of the states like Pennsylvania a bit less aggressive than others that have kind of established net zero greenhouse gas emissions targets. But most of the states have a fairly aggressive target, and that's what leads to these aggressive aggregated lines that you see on the graph here.
And I think there's you know, no coincidence that it's no surprise that the states who have set for themselves climate targets that are in line with, you know, some of the science that we're hearing about the climate crisis have also invested the time and energy to create a tool to drive down greenhouse gas emissions like RGGI. So I think they kind of go hand in hand. So we are at time. I really appreciate everyone coming. And I really look forward to getting to partner with a number of you on working to make RGGI all it can be. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.